adapting jurisprudential networks to stateless jurisdictions.
Okay, I'll be quite quick. Talking about adapting jurisprudential networks to stateless jurisdictions, and to a certain extent this answers hopefully a question about the law that was raised this morning. A complication is the fact, as you can see, we're connecting between the Faculty of Law, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and the Faculty of Engineering and IT. And I say a complication because those of us who are working in the cyber and working in complexity recognise that we don't really have a college of experts. So we will create a submission for a bid that is acceptable perhaps to the Faculty of Law, but is rejected by the social scientists or the engineering and IT. And this becomes a problem when you're trying to source additional funding and so on and so forth. So my paper will be looking at research aims and impacts, thematic bounds, cyber in law, and then look at future research and a worked example. And that goes beyond, in fact, the paper that we've presented, which is paper 22. And my apologies from Professor Gregory Tolhurst. He'd have loved to have been here today, but unfortunately couldn't make it. So our aim is to create a context for shared awareness of the decision-making and taking DMT process. Now, we do distinguish between decision-making and decision-taking. And I think this is something that sometimes we need to focus on. There are two different attributes to that particular aspect. In an adaptive organization, yes, fine, you might well have a decision-making then leading to the taking, and you have that sort of testing environmental ecology that we talk about. But we do distinguish between decision-making and decision-taking. And particularly, we're looking at common law and indeed customary law. And this is a division that the UK plays out very strongly in the UK at the moment, because essentially they have a customary law imposition from the EU, Germanic law, the codification of Roman law, as it were, and yet at the same time they've got common law, and this can create conflicts in the politics and in the way law is interpreted. So we look at common law, and we're looking at trying to see how you can encourage good behaviour within the cyber, within the way that we actually manage ourselves, rather than constantly punishing bad behaviour. The intended research impacts of where we're looking at is identifying, modelling and enabling jurisprudential networks to form across the various lacunae that we see existing, developing a methodology for law design adaptation in stateless jurisdictions, and I'll look a little bit at that later, and then enabling improved problem solving and accessibility to lawful resolution in stateless and cyber jurisdictions. What we're not trying to propose is new laws for cyber, yet another set of sort of securitate type laws to try and control the cyber. And that comes from some of the analytical work that we've done looking at complexity, and put in a nutshell, you can't control complexity. And so often what we're trying to do with jurisdictional legal requirements is to try and control that complexity. And very often it just makes it worse. So we looked at thematically at these three different areas: the jurisdictional network, the jurisprudential network. Now, the jurisprudential is the social perspective of the law. It's where the interpretation gets done. Very often when you look at countries in the Middle East, particularly those perhaps of an Islamic background, Iran, for example, you can't understand the system unless you understand the jurisprudential networks that exist within those constructs. You cannot understand the law, the socialization of the law in a common law setting unless you understand those jurisprudential networks that make sense of the jurisdiction or the jurisdictional networks. And then we looked at network law, and this came out of work where we started to think, what is the engineer, what is the big data engineer, what is the lawyer of the 21st century going to look like? And we recognized there were certain things that the lawyer or the engineer of the 21st century would be doing that are very similar. But there are certain aspects where you are going to find that aspects that can be programmed will be taken away. They'll be done by other people. So your focus as a lawyer is very much going to be on those cross-jurisprudential or cross-jurisdictional issues, which you can't solve through some kind of linear programming. So that idea of network law, which is for those programmable aspects such as conveyancing. Previously, and this was 2 years ago, we discussed and thought through what cyber might be, and this goes back to a paper actually was developed for the UK back in about 2008. And what we really see here is that cyber essentially comprises or combines, ideally synthesizes two poles. One which is an infotechno system, and the other a socio-infotechno system. One which is about coordination, rule and control, if you like, those hard rules, and one which is about collaboration and social influence, those more soft aspects. And in that particular combination, what we often see is a reversion to control, to the coordination, rule and control of the cyber, rather than trying to encourage perhaps some of those more influential aspects that would come from the treatment of it as a social system, as a socio-techno system or infotechno system. We spoke earlier about the idea of synthetic ecologies, and one of the aspects we looked at then is this idea of going from essentially an ecological identification to a classification of the system, in this case a classification of the legal cyber ecology, to be that system and entity that adapts over time by combining dynamically those interacting jurisdictional and jurisprudential networks, including those organisms and communities they make up, the physical and technological mechanical components of their environment, so trying to get down to what we might consider that ecology can be. And often what we've seen in the past is, of course, we standardize and optimize before we actually understand the system. And if you're optimizing on a system that you haven't classified or identified, very often you get the wrong answers, the wrong solutions. And we'll see this a little bit later on. So I'm afraid that's a pretty messy chart, but what we were trying to look at here was the division of the law within the cyber sort of jurisdiction jurisprudence, and the two sides, those two poles. So one, the weak signal, but strong influence, the soft side, the soft law, building into that socio-infotechno sort of combination, the collaborative social influence, and very much the decision-making and taking back to that DMT over time. On the other side then, the strong signal, weak influence, the hard infotechno-socio system, the coordination, rule and control, and essentially ideal, of course, when you're sort of in the manufacturing or the network program, the network law, where you're actually trying to do things and deliver things in time. That aspect of fuzzy law that's beginning to come through. And of course, this is moving away from that probabilistic to Zadeh's idea of possibility and indeed plausibility logic to try and look at those grey areas where the law is not necessarily certain. And this can often be a problem for both statutory and common law because, generally speaking, they are looking for certainty and they're trying to create certainty against which judgments can be made after the event. And yet so often we're actually dealing with real-time events, dynamic events, non-ergodic as opposed to the ergodic type structures and systems that are very much sort of perhaps looked at after the event, or can be looked at after the event. And then the two different types, the statute rather than statute, that gives less value to informal customary rules, and on the other side, the statutory gives essentially more value to those codified rules. And then back to the common law perspectives, the differences in the two main jurisdictional codes. What we've seen, though, is in an interpretation is what we call at the centre there is that sort of new hard triangle, which essentially describes 4 or 3 different areas there. Legalism on the one hand, protectionism and managerialism. And because of the sort of overhead questions, perhaps because of the way that these have created straitjackets in those bottom 3 quadrants, you have this flight to cyber. But you don't really or necessarily have within that cyber the protection, the jurisprudential networks that are forming to actually make sense of that. So what we see is a growth in that cyber, that stateless idea, stateless jurisdictions, which we'll talk about now, I'll bring up a little bit later. But you have that drive into that cyberspace where very often you have the creation of the dark web, but you're often also putting, if you like, people alongside that dark web, creating the opportunities for corruption or abuses to occur. Of course, and also an area where, as we know, major companies like to be in that organization or that area because they can avoid taxation and other perspectives that a jurisdiction might otherwise apply on them. So future research, studies of social network identity, and this comes up to something I spoke about yesterday, this idea of radicalization within the networks, the creation of these xeno networks, which comes from xenophobia. So these very alike bubble communities that can exist unchallenged very often and are much less tolerant perhaps than an environment like today where I've got to meet you and discuss you and try and explain what I'm talking about. I can hide in that web very often and not be challenged. That's one of the sort of downsides that we see in some of the bubble communities. We're also trying to look at these ideas which came out in discussion earlier on of uncertainty and instability. Not necessarily the same thing, but instability can obviously lead to uncertainty and uncertainty can lead to instability. And what we can see in certain instances, particularly when we're trying to optimize, if you like, a system that is highly uncertain in the first place, we haven't done that classification, is that we can create significant instabilities in the system. At the same time, a certain dynamic, a certain amount of noise in the system or uncertainty is important for innovation, for testing the structures that we have, for adaptation, for agility. So we don't want to remove all that noise or uncertainty from the system. At the same time, if we try and control it too much, then that, by our definitions, can also create that instability in the system. Statelessness, in this case, we were looking at essentially statelessness in the law to nation states, the cyber and social physical matters, and post-Aristotelian times might be thought as metaphysics. So these conditions of statelessness are high uncertainty and instability. There exists a possibility of phase change as new emergent structures condense, articulate and define new beings. And the example that we've looked at is a historical case in Australia, which was the Coal Cliffs study. And we've essentially reproduced, and this is a longitudinal graph of various stages in a construction of a joint venture. Now, a joint venture in this case was essentially between two different collieries, coal-producing companies, to form a new one. And they went through various sort of, if you like, statelessness because they were creating a new state or a new being, going from an agreement to consider the joint venture through to the final aspects of an execution of the joint venture. It didn't actually succeed in the end, and it broke down for a number of reasons. And what we've done is, through other analysis, you can look at scaling of the various program, is looked at uncertainty and uncertainty index within the negotiations. So in the first instance, what happens here is that 3 members of the Bowdler family, who were one of the main representatives, die. You have this very high uncertainty, and the negotiations end, but then pick up again here. What happens over in this particular phase is that the original collaboration partners, so the higher the uncertainty, actually the more transparency, the more collaboration you need to make sense of that uncertainty. And yet what was happening here is that this was becoming more and more a legal domain. So what we saw was the green line there is essentially the heads of agreement, and getting more and more uncertain until it broke down. And the purple line there was the joint venture negotiations, which begin about here. What we were able to do is to reconstruct this and put in degrees of expertise, which meant that you began to move the levels of uncertainty into what we've seen in different areas as being a manageable amount of, if you like, noise or uncertainty in the system at around about 20–25%. Now, this is either in future work, but looks at that idea of statelessness, of uncertainty within the system, but also that importance for it to enable collaboration and trust to form, and hence obviously a significant basis of the work that we're doing. So, conclusions, we see common law as a complex system, but also that one would be a tipping point that could result in a dramatic system change in how people interact within the cyber. It could either go one of two either ways, either encouraging collaboration or breaking that collaboration down. We particularly look at how do we apply this and tackle some of the antisocial contents such as exist within the dark web. And this is an area that Sir Tim Berners-Lee is really looking at the moment. How do we tackle those dark corners and create transparency in the web and therefore good behavior and all the rest of it? We look at that statelessness, but we're also looking at organizations and how do we actually preserve organizations, the goods of organizations and ultimately institutions, so that they actually preserve over time. So what is that combination of the, if you like, the collaborative and social influence and the coordination, rule and control that we need to achieve that balance and that change and adaptation over time? And that comes into an area that Anne was looking at. How do we recreate the institutions that will preserve, identify and enable us to all work successfully within the cyber, with big data, and so on and so forth, and maintain those trusts, those common ideas, those common goods that we were speaking about. So that's the area of work. It's slightly different to where perhaps we've been in the past. We're beginning to sort of make some inroads, but we're quite excited by some of the perspectives that are likely to come out of this, and this, if you like, rejoining of the law with some of the constructs that we're involved with. Thank you.